Hello and welcome to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. The Stability and Growth Pact is one of the most controversial areas of EU policy. But what is it and why does it matter? With me to discuss what's often called the Austerity Pact and the latest proposals to reform it is Left MEP José Gusmão. Hi, José. Good afternoon.
Hi. Good afternoon.
So just to kick off, can you tell us what this pact is all about and how it affects people living in Europe?
So the pact establishes rules on economic policy and especially budgetary policy, and creates limits that are one of the bases for the controversy because they are arguably arbitrary and they are mostly connected with the status in which Germany was when the pact was first signed. And these rules, and this is the most serious aspect, limit the way in which governments can use their national budget against, for instance, economic and social crises. And one of the things that it has been criticized for is, I'm going to say a big word, it's pro-cyclicality. What does this mean? This means that when you have an economic crisis, the kinds of rules that we have in the Growth and Stability Pact, and namely the fact that it limits public spending, limits the capacity of those governments to respond to those economic crises. And for that reason, these economic rules have helped to make economic downturns worse than they had to be, and usually at the expense of people who live out of their wages or pensions, because these are the forms of income that are most attacked by these kinds of policies.
Okay, so isn't this whole policy area, José, actually quite simple when you break it down? It's just about where to spend taxpayers' money and who gets to decide?
Yes, I mean, there is an issue of democracy here because for a large part of European economic history, the rule was that when you had an economic crisis, the first order of business was to counteract it, to spend public money, either in direct transfers, for instance, for people who were unemployed, or in public investment, but in both cases with the purpose of reaching full employment as soon as possible. And then when you had a more stable economic situation, you would take care of your public accounts. This is what became known as counter-cyclical policies. Basically, they mean that when you have a crisis, so people are not spending as much because maybe they don't have a job, and companies are not investing as much, the state will spend and invest to compensate that downturn. And this kind of policy generated more than 3 decades of economic prosperity with reasonable levels of income distribution and very high levels of employment. And after the liberal turn of the 80s, what we saw was a reversal of these policies, and the Growth and Stability Pact could be described as the victory of liberal economic policies, neoliberal economic policies. And with the Growth and Stability Pact, what we had was exactly the opposite. Extremely low growth in the European Union, a growing inequality in income distribution, and economic crisis one after the other, and usually more serious than they had to be. And I mean, I would say the most spectacular example was the financial crisis and its consequences. But for the most part, the Growth and Stability Pact has, quite paradoxically, been a synonym for lack of growth and lack of stability.
Okay, now you mentioned a couple of terms there that I'd never heard of before, and I think this is kind of representative of this whole debate. A lot of these terms are kind of economic governance, are jargony, are words that aren't in our day-to-day parlance. So if it's okay with you, I'd love to do a quick fire jargon-busting round. So I'll say the terminology in bureaucraties, and you say what it means in normal language.
I'll try.
Okay. So let's get started. The first one is six-pack.
Okay, six-pack is a number of, it's 5 regulations and 1 directive, which basically have to do with the implementation of the Growth and Stability Pact, 3 of the regulations, and then the other 3 have to do with some related legislation. One very significant one is the procedural for excessive deficits, which basically has to do with what is called the corrective pillar of the Growth and Stability Pact, and it's basically lays down the instruments through which the Commission can get tough, and it's the most ugly face of the Growth and Stability Pact. And you also have something that is very important, although very neglected, which is the procedure for macroeconomic imbalances. And this should be a very important instrument because it deals with several variables that have to do with the economic relationships between member states. For instance, their commercial balances between each other, but it's very underestimated in economic policy because dealing with those imbalances would force us to look at the way that countries like Germany or the Netherlands are actually gaining asymmetrically from the European integration process at the expense of peripheral economies such as Portugal, Greece, or others.
Okay, so nothing to do with beers then, six-packs. The next one we've got is two-pack. So something related or different?
Yeah, the six-pack, the two-pack is an extension of the six-pack that led to what were thought as important corrections to the process of the six-pack. But I mean, I would say that it was more of the same. Okay,
and European semester?
The European semester is a process of economic policy coordination, although I should say that for the most part, that's not what the role that's been having. I mean, the idea of coordination is a very friendly one, as if member states would gather around the table and would find common goals. But for the most part, the European semester establishes a series of policies, economic policies, but also labor market policies, expenditure policies, public services policies, privatization. And it has been used to put pressure on member states to implement a neoliberal agenda that was never voted for, and it's basically comes out of the European Commission and goes through the other institutions. For instance, one of our objectives would be to introduce social and environmental criteria into the European semester. But the biggest problem has to do with the way that it works. It's an instrument against democratic decision-making at the national level. And that's one of the most negative aspects of this whole economic governance framework. It's that it's built to undermine the democratic government's programs and the priorities that people have chosen, which may not be the best at national level, but they're the ones that the people have actually chosen.
Okay, and last one, and this one's a bit of a mouthful. Country-specific midterm budgetary objectives. Well,
in the process of the European semester and the economic governance monitoring instruments, there are countries are again invited to have adjustment objectives for their deficit, for their public debt, and medium term is something that can be considered around 5 or 10 years. But the truth is that usually political pressure on member states is much more concentrated in the very short term on immediate adjustment, and that is one of the most negative aspects of the economic governance framework, is that countries, when they need to support their economy, support their public services, support their people, quite often don't have the maneuvering space because the rules are so strict and they are more aligned with the very short term.
Okay, and so the European Commission just came up with some new proposals to change the pact. They talk about more ownership. What do they mean when they say this? More ownership for member states, sorry.
Well, I mean, the ownership is one of those pieces of jargon in European institutions that basically has to do with national governments and countries being involved in the decision-making of their policies, and there is some kind of response to the criticism on the Growth and Stability Pact and the economic governance framework for being an instrument against national democracies. Unfortunately, this whole ownership campaign on the Commission's proposal for the new rules is false advertising. And what we would see with these new rules is exactly the opposite. On a permanent basis, you would have, again, Commission technicians making political decisions. The first one would be to find a trajectory for public accounts for each country, which is considered a technical trajectory, but it's not. I mean, it's basic macroeconomic policy decision making. And then the member states are responsible for elaborating their own adjustment plan with reforms and investments and so on. But that plan has to be first negotiated with the Commission. In the end, the Commission has to approve it. And in the end, the Council has to approve it. And during its implementations, the countries can have visits by technical teams of the Commission, just like in the Troika. They can bring people from the ECB, just like in the Troika. So this whole mechanism is built like a sort of new Troika without the IMF, and a permanent one. You know, a Troika without the IMF and without an expiration date. A permanent instrument to put pressure on governments, and also a mechanism through which the Commission can give a little more flexibility to the member states that implement the reforms that the Commission wants to see implemented, and less flexibility to the countries who want to pursue their own democratic chosen agenda. And this is one of the most, it's actually the worst aspect of this new proposal by the Commission. It gives the Commission an enormous and completely discretionary power to define areas of economic and social policy that are not even European competence. So to infiltrate the national competences and the choices that should belong to democracy at the national level.
Okay, so this whole idea of ownership actually is kind of jargony in and of itself. It's not what they would have you believe.
And I would say that it reveals some kind of bad conscience, because what is happening, what is being proposed, is precisely the opposite. And for instance, if we talk about democratic accountability, in these rules, the Commission has to approve the plans, the Council has to approve the plans. There are two institutions that are not involved in any stage, which is the European Parliament and the national parliaments. And that tells you something about the level of democratic legitimacy that these plans will have.
Okay, I wanted to go back, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, to climate change. And so the European Commission, it's recognised that we need a huge amount of public investment if we are going to tackle the climate crisis. Do these new proposals in the pact kind of facilitate that?
No, and actually that's one of the most disappointing aspects of the proposal, because one of the most important criticisms to the previous rules was made by the European Fiscal Board. And one of the points they made is that these rules are extremely harmful for public investment. And one of their proposals was that public investment was excluded when it came to calculating a country's deficit, because it was considered, and rightly so, that budgetary rules should benefit public investment policies. And what happens is that this proposal has no kind of legal protection for public investment. So it's in complete contradiction with the Commission's appeals on member states to invest in the climate crisis or the digital transition or the social crisis. And it even backtracks on previous positions on the European semester and economic governance rules from 2015, where the Commission introduced the idea of creating some sort of positive discrimination on investment expenditure. Those references are completely eliminated, and this new package says nothing about how to protect and promote public investment. So one doesn't really see how these new rules can be compatible with the objectives that the Commission is always talking about, such as the climate and digital transitions.
I wanted to just zoom in on your home country, Portugal, for a moment. It was one of the EU countries that suffered greatly from the debt crisis and the adjustments at that time. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what it was like. What did people go through at that time?
That's a very interesting question, because in Portugal, we had a Troika program, which was based on the same kind of economic reasoning that underpins the Growth and Stability Pact and is still present in this new proposal, which is the idea that you reduce a country's indebtedness by cuts, by cutting on public services, on wages, on pensions, and that's what happened in Portugal. And the result of those policies was a massive economic and social crisis, one of the biggest recessions of our democratic history. And that crisis, the economic crisis, generated a sharp increase in the country's indebtedness, basically for two reasons, because the indebtedness level is the relationship between the amount of debt and a country's, a country's products. And if you have a recession, this means that this ratio is going to shoot over its current levels. And the second aspect is if you have an economic crisis, that means that tax revenue of the country is going down and social expenditure has to go up because of the economic and social crisis. And so the result of this program was not just a massive economic and social crisis, but a sharp increase in Portugal's debt to GDP ratio. So it generated precisely the opposite result of it failed on its own terms, on its own objectives. And I think today this is more widely recognized, but not in the rules. We still have rules that have to do with this kind of economic thinking, which is fundamentally flawed and needs to change in our economic governance framework so that we can deal with future crises.
And so on those rules, is it fair to say that they've been applied inconsistently? You know, there's been instances where Germany and France have breached the rules, but sanctions haven't been applied. But then when it comes to countries like Greece and Italy, they've been treated a bit differently.
Well, we had a Commission president that said France is France, and he was referring to what is obviously a very different level of enforcement of these rules. I don't know if it's very widely known, but the first country ever to break the rules of the Growth and Stability Pact was Germany, and obviously nothing happened. And there is a certain tradition of basically suspending rules whenever Germany needs the rules to be suspended. We had a new example now, for instance, with the suspension of the rules on the internal market. Germany wanted to support their companies, and that was not possible under the single market rules. So the single market rules were suspended so that Germany could follow their own policies. And I would say that that has been true throughout the implementation of the Growth and Stability Pact and other European rules. And it's going to get worse with this new proposal, because this proposal gives so much discretion to the European Commission in the way that it monitors and enforces the economic governance framework rules, that it will increase the level of the inequality of treatment between member states. I think that's something that we can predict with a very high level of certainty. Germany will have a certain set of rules, and Portugal or Greece or Ireland will have a very different one.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, José Gusmão. I think we'll have to leave it there, but that was a great deep dive into economic governance. So if you want to find out more about the Stability and Growth Pact, then please go to our website, left.eu, where you can find articles and listicles that go into a bit more detail. Thank you for watching.